Hi YouTubers and the YouTube pipe community. First of all, the homework. I'm smoking my skull pipe, which is appropriate for tonight. And in it I've got some Blatter and Blatter Executive Mix. I'm going to tell you a story. The story is entitled I Am the Last of My Kind, and I'll be reading it, so my eyes will be towards the side like that. It's a story I wrote about a year ago, I think. It might be a bit long, but I hope it's not too long. So I want you to imagine that you've come and you're sat in the room with me. And we're sharing a pipe. I knew something was wrong when Lara, my housekeeper, came into the living room. Tears were running down her cheeks, and she looked as if her world had ended. I got up from my seat and took her into my arms. "What's wrong?" I asked. She took a deep breath and said, "I'm sorry, sir. George is dying, and he's sent for you." Well, my legs seemed to give way under me. My throat was so tight I could hardly breathe. And the tears began to flow. I heard Lara say, "There is only you now." I told him you would be straight over. Philip will drive you. Well, Philip was my driver bodyguard. George's death wasn't unexpected. After all, he was 403 years old, and he'd been ill for months. His death would be a blessing, really. If I'm honest, I wasn't crying for him. I was crying for me. George had taught me all I knew. He was always there for me. He was more than a friend and a brother, than anything else, and he'd chosen me to take over from him. I think he'd chosen me because I had no family, and was always seen as an outsider by those who knew me. Well, I went upstairs to get the leather case that contained the tools of our trade. I knew George would have what I needed, but I wanted to use my own things. As Philip drove me, I remembered the day George had called me to see me. I was in my early 20s and wasting my life doing odd jobs and living like a hippie. George looked as if he was in his 50s. I learnt later that people in our profession were extremely long-lived. No one really knew much about him. He seemed to have plenty of money and lived in one of the biggest houses in the area. He would disappear for a few days at a time, but he spent most of his time at home, didn't seem to do anything. He seemed to know all about me and invited me for a drink at the local bar. At first I thought he was making a play for me. But as we talked, he asked me if I had a faith and what I believed happened when I died. I told him I was a lapsed Catholic. Then we turned to the topic of sin and confession. By now I was getting a bit bored by the turn of events. I got up to leave, but he grabbed my arm and he said he wanted to offer me a job as his assistant. The sum he offered was far more than I could earn. legally. So I asked what I was supposed to do to earn that amount of money. Philip interrupted my thoughts, and we'd arrived at George's house. I was let in by George's housekeeper, led upstairs to the bedroom where George lay waiting for me. As I entered, he smiled, but I could see he was worried about something. Perhaps he thought I wouldn't come. However, he was more worried about me. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked. "You know what it will mean?" "I know what it means, but I will keep my word," I answered. Having asked if he was ready, I removed the pillows and laid his head flat. Taking my case, I reached for the chalk, and on the headboard wrote the traditional words. Blood in. And at the foot of the bed, I wrote blood out. Taking my small crucifix, I placed it on his forehead. All that remained was to place a piece of bread and a small pile of salt on his chest. We exchanged a brotherly kiss and made our farewells. As I picked up the salt and the bread, I also took hold of all the sins he had committed and all the sins he had eaten. As I placed the elements into my mouth and swallowed, George smiled and died forgiven. I, on the other hand, felt and saw every sin he had swallowed or committed during his long life as a sin-eater. I was now the last sin-eater in the world. George had left everything he owned to me, including the history of sin-eaters through the ages. Most people thought we had died out in the early 20th century in Ireland. But the Irish sin-eaters were an offshoot, caused by the fear of not having a priest to hear confession at death. I knew I stood no chance of any priest hearing my confession and giving me absolution, as in the Middle Ages the Catholic Church had decided that all sin-eaters were excommunicated. I also knew that it was unlikely to find someone to take on the work. But that was the choice I made all those years ago when George took my arm. He offered to show me what I would have to do. He took me to an old house in the poorer part of town. When we entered, everyone was gathered round the bed of an old lady called Mary. Clearly Mary knew George well, and they spent a short time in conversation. When she was ready, she took a drink of the poison she had in the glass beside her, and George carried out the ritual. Afterwards, we spent some time with the family, and they told us Mary's story and why she needed a sin-eater rather than a priest. As a young woman, her sister Jane had had an affair with a priest and had become pregnant. The priest was moved on to another parish, but Jane was treated by the church and congregation as an outcast. When the time came, she was taken to a local convent to have the baby. Soon as the child was born, it would be taken and given to a rich family for adoption. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. The child was dying as it was being born. A priest was sent for, but refused baptism on the grounds that the child was already dead. The child was also refused a Christian burial, and the family were advised to bury the baby in the field. Jane died shortly after of puerperal fever, and because she was an unmarried mother and had died before being shriven, she was given a very simple graveside burial. Mary, of course, was devastated. She believed that her sister, being unshriven, was going to hell, and the baby to purgatory. She believed that the baby deserved to be with its mother, and having dug it up, she reburied it in Jane's grave. Unfortunately, she was seen. At a trial, she was accused of desecration of the grave. And the disturbance and stealing of a body. The church spoke at her trial, accusing her of sacrilege, Satanism, and explained to the judge just how her crimes had disturbed the peace of the community. Mary was sent to jail for 40 years, without parole, and the church excommunicated her. Eventually, public opinion changed, and society began to understand mental illness better. A group of people fought for Mary's release, and after 20 years, she was released a broken and sick woman. Gradually, her health improved, but the family never got over what had happened, and the church refused to admit her back into the family of the church. From the moment I heard Mary's story, I knew I would accept George's offer, even if it cost me my very soul. Not everyone receives the services of a sin eater. He chooses whose sins to eat. And although he's paid for his services, the charge depends upon the sin eater. Often we took nothing more than a simple coin. At other times, our price was very high. As the last of the sin eaters, my personal cost would be the highest of all.